What happens when you combine flying rats, crippling drug addiction, and weapons of mass destruction with late-stage capitalism? In today's video, we'll be obliterating our competition by deploying a rat air force, building an undercity megacorporation to exploit the most hated societies on the planet, and starting a nuclear war. Standing in our way, we have the 4-foot bodybuilders with severe anger management issues, a dedicated mukbang guild consisting of the local redditors, and women that treat human rights violations as personal bucket list. Will I succeed in building a Skaven utopia, or die under a tide of violently naked men? Let's find out. Welcome to Skaven, the capital of innovation and home to world-leading science. Right now, we're in the state of every college student. Broke and starving. Our neighbors are either actively trying to exterminate us, or a cove of vampire pirates with a sexual attraction to boats. So if I have to choose, I'd rather fight the elderly. When it comes to the Empire, every man is a walking Second Amendment, with copious amounts of racism to back it up. I, on the other hand, have access to 1,200 counter-arguments per minute and a frontline that doubles as an advanced guidance system. After the local nursing homes have been converted to prime real estate, I can begin establishing my network of hidden call centers around the world. And by the world, I mean Elf one. Mainly because everyone hates the elves.
Absolutely terrible.
I'm not making a lot of gold yet, but eventually the elven streets will be flooded with Skaven in full Adidas tracksuits. Without my regulations, the world would devolve into a capitalist nightmare, where selling homeless people body parts from your van is considered an acceptable part-time job. So, allow me to save you from yourselves. Admittedly, like every great businessman, I am an addict. The words low profit margins may not mean anything to you, but it's enough to send me into a murderous rage. So, after evicting the local tribesmen off their land and signing a peace treaty with Astalia, we sit and watch the equivalent of 2 meth addicts fight for the right to sleep on our sidewalk, while in reality, we're just waiting to shoot whoever survives. Warhammer is a rough place. We need a steady supply of limbs. However, when it comes to consumption, these guys were competitive eaters. It was only a matter of time before their violent obesity reaches my borders. That is why shooting my neighbor in the back of her head is actually a form of self-defense. You see, this is a gated community, and we have a strict policy of no decomposing in front of people, which now, after being shot, she's actively violating. And with her gone, we can now focus on the real problem. There is a widespread famine originating somewhere in this region. I'm not pointing any fingers, but I am pointing guns. Unfortunately, years of mindless consumption has granted them immunity to bullets. So if you're ever faced with 3 obscenely large men, simply stand on the hill. This will drastically improve your chances of survival in a form of a heart attack. The other 2 armies of our horizontally challenged opponents descended towards us, making me slightly nervous. But this game is full of fun little surprises. Just like pirates have a thing for boats, I have a thing for narrow passages. And I don't care how resistant to bullets you are when I obliterate the entire ecosystem in a 10-mile radius. Now I couldn't help but notice their fat was acting like a smelly cushion. With the ogres dead, that put me dangerously close to a homicidal maniac, and she was violently upset by my existence. Coincidentally, so was France. Now, fellas, let me be very clear. I do not want to be saved, so I dive headfirst into their ambush because I want to make a great first impression. Naturally, I deployed in a corner, since my sniper teams specialize in causing severe head trauma, and while I do take pride in letting my men bravely stand in the enemy bombardment, we can't contest their melee units without getting absolutely run over. Fortunately, we won't have to. Now personally, I'm a big fan of explosions, but let me ask you something. If I showed up to your house in the middle of the night and detonated 1,000 tons of TNT in your backyard, would that upset you, especially when you're 4 foot tall and 100% of your diet is made up of anabolic steroids? Well, these guys certainly were, and now legions of burly, shirtless men were pouring into my territory. Somehow years of mountain dwelling bestowed them with an unnatural resistance to nuclear rockets, and my bullets provided all the stopping power of a Nerf gun. I attempted to slow them down by shoving a spear to anyone who still owned both of their arms. Our coastline was suddenly on fire. Naturally, I did what any brave Skaven in my position would do. This only seemed to enrage them even further, and they left no survivors. I also noticed 2 armies marching into my home region in the attempt to burn down my already burning pile of garbage. That meant next battle was a free therapy, directly into the skulls of my enemies at supersonic velocity. Now, this might seem kind of broken. That's because it is. Every engagement felt less like a battle and more like a war crime, which technically it was, considering my strict policy of no prisoners. When a pleasant woodland walk suddenly turns into an orbital bombardment, running away is actually the correct evolutionary response. Eventually, I pushed through the mountain pass back into the original Valley of Corpses. Unfortunately, her welcome gift was two naked men stacked on top of each other and a mouth gag. It was less of a greeting and more of a threatening invitation. So I decided to repay them with PTSD. I take pride in my ability to systematically delete my own units. Skaven doctrine is simple. If they can hold a spear, they can leave their wives as single mothers. The real question is, how many allies can I accidentally kill while still technically winning the battle? It's like a fun little math puzzle, except the answer is always not enough. In game's own words, this was a close victory. This is where my relationship with Elspeth took a dramatic nosedive. Not the kind where you argue over dinner and reconcile later. Kind where I have to keep fighting a series of exponentially stronger ex-boyfriends that keep showing up to my house at 3 AM. So I downloaded a mod called Console Commands and handed her the entire empire. Now, instead of 20 different micro-factions all hating me individually, I was fighting one united mega-faction with the GDP of Europe. Oh, and I gave friends everything west of Rhine too. Most people would look at a massive fort with 10,000 snipers and think, maybe not today, but not Elspeth. She treats fortified positions the same way I treat STDs, not as a deterrent, but as a challenge. So after a few turns, she decided to resume our conflict by running headfirst into a wall. I was afraid I accidentally gave her irreparable brain damage. Fortunately, I was immediately reassured when 6 more armies spawned directly in front of me, as well as the French. They arrived with 4 stacks out of nowhere, which is why I built a healthy stockpile of doom rockets and bunkered down in the nearest city, in case I needed a disposable frontline. At this point, I had accepted 2 truths. 1, I was going to die, and 2, if I was going to die, I wanted to be while 2 insane women tied me to a chair and beat my balls like a piñata. Unfortunately, this is not the time for recreational masochism, because my family is being held at gunpoint by the game to force me into a siege battle. So if I have to be miserable, so do the next 10 local peasant generations. Elspeth charged headfirst into my bullets and immediately suffered what I can only describe as her 15th concussion this week. I'm not sure if it's possible to get one just from the sound of the ricochet, but those guys are about to find out. At this point, this woman's skull has more holes than my game plan. For example, being outnumbered as Skaven feels very unnatural, especially when you're outnumbered by the French. What we lack in numbers, we make up in our foreign policy. Now, I'm not a French soldier, but I imagine seeing raining warp fire, mechanical spider creatures with dual Gatling guns, whilst your primary form of defense is a shirt worn by 5 previous generations, didn't inspire a lot of confidence. The same way my mind couldn't comprehend seeing 2 more armies garrisoned in the city. So out of calculated desperation, I decided to attack, somehow forgetting that I'm playing as a Skaven, which turns Warhammer into a horror game. For everyone else, I believe fleeing into different directions after witnessing me decapitate their comrade is the only acceptable human response. It also means now they're too far away to reinforce each other. This allowed me to completely dismantle the French frontline, since I don't think anyone expected the trees to suddenly come alive with endless Gatling fire. So in other words, in a single turn, I gave the entire French army collective paranoid schizophrenia, and from that point forward, they avoided combat like I was the IRS. If the French had learned to run away from me, these guys learned that the solution to every problem was throw more bodies until one of us stops moving. I immediately defaulted to French maxing into the nearby woods, while making my city look as submissive and breedable as possible. Gentlemen, our goal here isn't to win. It's to make the enemy question if fighting suicidal naked ratmen worth the minimum wage. There's something you need to understand. The value of Skaven life is measured entirely by how many units they can drag with them into the afterlife. So these boys were going to Skaven heaven. My remaining units set up barricades and engaged in chemical warfare with 99% lethality rate on both sides. If you're the kind of person that believes in happy endings, it's time for you to close your eyes and pretend that their second army didn't immediately show up and kill every single one of us. I marched naked back into the city. Now, I was assuming I only have to face 2 more armies. Instead, what I got was psychological warfare. AI began redeploying over and over, never committing to a single attack and mentally wearing me down, as if they somehow sensed it was 2 AM and I was 1 Red Bull away from blowing my brains out. So like like any well-adjusted sociopath, I took out my frustrations by exerting dominance on a weaker faction. At this point, fighting the French felt less like a war and more like chasing a foreign exchange student who somehow still managed to outrun us despite being bound to a wheelchair. Luckily, that didn't stop their country from slowly burning to death, and I even managed to trap their leader in a mountain, which I'm pretty sure is a form of kidnapping, but I don't care, as long as it gets me out of doing any siege battles. This must have triggered some intense fear as she immediately attacked us instead. And by us, of course, I mean a line of invisible rat snipers who possess the ability to perform a successful vasectomy from 20 miles away. The rest of the French campaign felt like a reenactment from the 1940s. You are going to be run over by an unhealthy amount of tanks, bombed by artillery you cannot see, and ultimately develop a rational hatred towards foreign languages. This resulted in a short campaign victory and got us one step closer to our goal. Meanwhile, Elspeth spent the last 10 turns conscripting and brainwashing every homeless man in the Empire, which made them associate Skaven death squeals with erotic arousal. But there's only one thing all Skaven fear more than anything: an enemy who wants to be bombed. Suddenly, siege battles became so easy that I was willing to lose a quarter of my army just to keep them away from one more turn. Unfortunately, I have the survival skills of a piece of wet fabric, so my neck too was begging to be wrung. It is the wet dream of every Skaven player to be tried as a war criminal, especially if the target of the said war crimes are our own people. After completely obliterating what used to be an army, I decided it was time to put Elspeth out of her misery. Unfortunately, she had the same idea, but this time with twice the artillery and 4 times the naked men, which proved to be surprisingly effective and even managed to turn my weapons against me, in the sense that they refused to get off my units and I refused to cease fire. At this point, she suffered one concussion too many, and the rest of the Empire campaign can be summed up like this. I conquer a city and immediately start spreading the joys of bathing in piles of garbage. People get upset at the sight of naked Skaven rot-maxing in public, so they pick up rusty pitchforks and begin shouting racial slurs.
Birmingham is a fucking shithole!
I then try to convince them that there is no such thing as a peaceful protest in the Skaven Empire by firing explosive projectiles into the crowd. Rinse and repeat for about 10 turns. With Elspeth now safely institutionalized in our finest psychiatric hospital, I was in search of some new friends. And what better friends than someone who already shared our hatred towards the Empire? So I politely asked out the Vikings for dinner. They declined, so I pointed a gun to their face and asked again. Long story short, we're now mortal enemies. The thing about the Vikings is that they like to spend their days raiding local fentanyl dealers, running butt naked in the woods, and punching random people in parking lots. Any attempt to convince them otherwise usually results in a violent and strangely romantic demise. Luckily though, it doesn't get more convincing than 30,000 rounds per minute. By the time I was finishing up the Empire, I kept getting random factions asking me to sign dubious deals for small sums of gold, only to watch them wipe their ass with their contract literally the next turn.
What?
I was also getting harassed by my allies to fight the elves despite them not sharing any borders, while I was just one ocean cross away. Normally, I would not be interested in this type of endeavor, since very much like the Vikings, they spent the centuries sexually dominating other species to fight alongside them, except they're much worse. But the game decided I don't get a choice. What made me more upset was the fact that my allies were willing to pay me money to fight the elves only to abandon me the moment they declared war on me. This made me very angry, and much like a cartoon villain, my natural response was an attempt to blow up their cities by constructing a nuclear device under their sewers. Unfortunately, this only made them aware of the fact that I had sleeper cells in their every settlement, as if they suddenly woke up from a coma and realized they had to wade through piles of garbage just to get inside a grocery store. So in order to win the campaign, we need to hold at least 7 of these settlements. We already own these 3. The 4th one is actually nearby, a lovely little touristy resort in northern Siberia called the Hell Pit, which I heard is very lovely at this time of year. Now the last 3 are owned by the Skaven, who were also our allies up until like 10 seconds ago. I'm already on my way to punch my way through Kislev, but I didn't want to fight the number 5th rank power whilst also fighting against what's canonically known as the most genocidal faction in all of Warhammer, who are especially racist against Skaven. That is us. So like a crack-addicted prostitute with Stockholm syndrome, I'm going to have to sell one of my kidneys in order to afford to feed my family of 45. In the meantime, it turns out fighting the Elven Navy with a bunch of ratmen and rowboats isn't exactly what you'd call an effective strategy, especially when not only do they not get dissuaded by the sight of their friends spontaneously combusting, they run towards it. This means we need an entirely new branch of military, equipped to deal with extreme deviancy of high elf societies, which is to say, I fed a bunch of radioactive warpstone to lab-grown alligators and formed death squads specializing in psychological warfare. I had this sense of impending impending doom that I could not explain. So I wanted to finish up my war with the Northerners by convincing them that we could still be friends, by turning their cities into slightly more charred version of the original, whilst also taking away their ability to reproduce. Kistov's form of strategy consisted of conscripting local zoo animals, and despite the fact we had attack helicopters, the game was telling us this was a valiant defeat. In response, I wrote a 52-page essay on why it's physically impossible to lose. Page 1. Since the first 1400 of their people dying in under 2 seconds wasn't convincing enough, I was forced to ingest a lethal dose of horse tranquilizers and slam my gas pedal into the crowd of their soldiers, which seemed to have secured the victory. Now I could move in and take their city. I also encircled the last army of Vikings, which turned into a battle of attrition, them slowly starving to death and us dying because the trees looked slightly wrong. That is, until we got attacked by one shirtless guy, who was forced to helplessly watch me set up an arsenal right about the point of their reinforcements, which was the equivalent of setting up a camera by the bed in a dirty hotel, with him sitting in a corner and watching me completely plow his army whilst maintaining eye contact the whole time. In fact, it was so intense it triggered the endgame crisis, which coincidentally reminded me that having both kidneys was a luxury we could no longer afford. With no time to lose, I landed in Elf 1 and started shooting indiscriminately, which caused another Elven faction to declare war on us. But the balance of power was so pathetic, I didn't even bother finishing the conversation before closing the window. Unfortunately, their friends were not so pathetic and actually outranked us in terms of power, which roughly translates to us fighting a ridiculous amount of dragons. Apparently, elves don't like it when you're committing genocide on their island, and were prepared to target us with copious amounts of sexual ambiguity to prove it. Now, with all the victory conditions met, we're going to win the game next turn. My ally decided this was the time to make a move against the ogres, faction I just signed a trade agreement with, and a faction who's ranked number 1 on power scale. Even though we won the game, I wasn't going to be satisfied until their capital was a pile of garbage, so I carried out one final attack. If you never had the chance to watch crack-addicted radioactive alligators fight overgrown lizards, you're welcome. Now, for our current situation, maybe the political landscape wasn't entirely ideal. We did win the game, but we also pretty much just walked into a bar, punched a group of racists, then agreed to have a drink with some bikers, whilst watching our friend we just met 10 seconds ago walk up to one of them and sucker punch them in the mouth. And lastly, we were told that a bunch of rival inbred rednecks were heading our way. But hey, at least we managed to sit at a table long enough to have a drink, flirt with a huzz that somehow ended up with her being carried out in a straitjacket, and kick the shit out of Betonia, which everyone applauded. So to sum it up, is the world perfect? Probably not. That's what makes it so fun. Thank you for watching today's video, and I'll see you next time.